My name is Matt Struthers, and I am the intern agrologist with Saskatchewan Agriculture and Moose Jaw, and I'll be chairing today's event. The session today will focus on the right placement aspect of 4R. The purpose of this webinar series is to we wanted to set these webinars up so we could use it as a reference in the future when we do extension on a more in-depth soil topics and have recordings that individuals can reference for background material. The 4R Stewardship Program was created by Fertilizer Canada, and today we have a few slides to touch on that Fertilizer Canada has kindly provided. 4R nutrient stewardship is an innovative approach for fertilizer best management practices. This approach considers economic, social, and environmental demonstrations of nutrient stewardship and is essential to the sustainability of agricultural systems. The concept is simple. Apply the right source of the right nutrient at the right rate and at the right time in the right place. But the implementation is knowledge intensive and site specific. The 4Rs are great in concept, but the next question is, how do we validate the 4Rs within Canada? Fertilizer Canada currently offers the 4R designation program in Western Canada. The designation program is a voluntary program for Canadian ag retailers currently implemented in the Canadian prairies. To learn more, I encourage you to visit the Fertilizer Canada website where you can learn about the designation program and how you can begin the process of becoming a 4R designated agronomist today. The 4R designation program is designed to provide innovative, science-based programs for Canadian ag retailers to demonstrate their commitment to sustainable nutrient management and ultimately environmental sustainability. Some resources, courtesy of Fertilizer Canada, have been attached to today's webinar question area box. 2020 was a record-breaking year for the program. 4R designated agronomists submitted a total of 3.3 million acres to Fertilizer Canada, with 1.5 million of these acres being from Saskatchewan alone. Fertilizer Canada is excited to see the building of the program and hopes to continue this trend as we work towards our target of 15 million validated acres by 2021. We encourage agronomists who haven't become 4R designated to consider starting the process today. And to learn more, please go to their website. All right, now back to the main event. We will begin today with a webinar, followed by a live Q&A session. The main hub for today will be your webinar screen, and we will share relevant information with you in the question box area. You will see that there is the 4R information and then also a 2021 webinar poster where you'll find links to future webinars. The entire session will be recorded, so if you miss anything or wish to revisit any of the presentations, you'll be able to. Recording and video links will be sent out later this week, along with event evaluations, so please ensure that you fill out the evaluations to help us determine what topics you want to learn more about and help us prioritize research needs for the future. If you are a CCA, you need to attend live to get credits. We have already gotten your CCA number at sign up, and we'll make sure to pass it on to Prairie CCA. If you have any questions regarding the CCA credits from today, please contact Ali Noble at ali.noble@gov.sk.ca. We have a few housekeeping tips to keep in mind during the webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them in the question box area on the right-hand side of your control panel. We will try to get to as many questions as possible, but may need to limit due to time. Your question will always be anonymous and only sent to me. During the presentation, you will also be muted so that we can ensure there is no feedback that will interfere with the audio. Our speaker today is the one and only Kim Stonehouse. Before joining the Ministry of Agriculture, Kim conducted agricultural research for the East Central Research Foundation in Kenora and was the coordinating agronomist for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Melfort. He has extensive knowledge related to new crop development, increasing existing crop value, enhanced production efficiency, and environmental stewardship. Kim, when you're ready, take it away.
Thank you so much, Matt.
You're welcome.
Good morning, everyone. As Matt mentioned, I've been invited to speak about the for our right place aspect. And so let's get started here. The first thing I did when I was asked to speak about this was to go out and look for some definitions. And basically, I found the principles set out by Fertilizer Canada for right placement. And the first one is to respect recommended setback distances for nutrient application near waterways. I had some difficulty finding these setback distances for Saskatchewan, so I contacted our agricultural engineers in Regina, and they informed me that these setback guidelines for manure application are generally stated as about 30 meters, but really for every intensive livestock operation, and this is mainly for manure application. Sorry, this is more for manure application than it is for fertilizer application. So basically, for every livestock operation, they must consult an agricultural engineer and work out a manure management plan. Alberta and Manitoba definitely have really good guidelines online that you can find their setback distances. For example, Alberta setback distance for manure if it's injected is 10 meters, and for broadcast manure it is 30 meters. So it really doesn't apply to fertilizer as much, but I thought it's important because we need to talk about, or we need to at least acknowledge that there is manure application. There are guidelines for that as well. So the second one then is to place nutrients below the soil surface where they can be taken up by growing roots when needed. Now this is a simple but a little bit vague explanation of what 4R and the right place are all about. Really, the right place should allow fertilizers to maximize yield and nutrient use efficiency, as well as minimize the losses to the environment. And I'm going to go on and discuss a little bit about that. So basically, when we're talking about fertilizer application and the right placement, there are a number of options that can be used when deciding where you're going to put that fertilizer. They include seed placed, sideband, mid-row band, deep band, broadcast, and possibly foliar applications. Some of these particular placement methods may have different names to them, and these are probably due to different regional dialects, or some people have adopted the manufacturer's names. I apologize if they're not the ones that you're used to or have heard in the past, but these are kind of the ones that I grew up with and throughout schooling was exposed to. So I'm going to use these, and they may differ a little bit from what you've heard in the past. I know that I ran into a lot of differences when I was doing research on this. Just a couple of notes to get started, I guess. I've been asked to show the differences between the different types of equipment that are available to make placement options possible. And this is because many people are not familiar with the actual equipment that is being used, and some may not be able to picture the systems when discussing the fertilizer placement, and that can cause some difficulties in discussions with producers. So this will hopefully give some of the people that are less exposed to equipment just a little bit of an idea of what kinds of things they're talking about. In discussing the options for placement, there are a few notes. The list of equipment options covers the most common types. There are other types besides the ones I have chosen to show. They may be less common, or they may be ones that I just didn't come up with or think about when I was putting this together, but I think I've got a pretty good list. There's no endorsement of products or brands here. The choice of fertilizer equipment, placement equipment, sorry, it depends on a number of different factors, including soil type. So soil texture and stoniness may factor into the types of equipment or tools that you will use. It depends largely on the crops to be seeded And some producers actually use different drills for different crops because they find that some work better with different size seeds or different depths of placement. Logistics is a big factor when you're thinking about your equipment needs. So spreading out the operations may be required to save time at seeding. So you may want to place fertilizer at a different time than seeding. Others will want to place that all in one pass to get everything done at the same time. It depends a little bit on environmental conditions, such as the expected yearly precipitation. And a lot of it will probably come down to personal preference. Sometimes this is the biggest factor that is needed when you're choosing the tool that you're going to use for fertilizer placement. When it comes to choosing a specific manufacturer's equipment, I'll say this: they are all designed to work. So I will not get into discussions about the different manufacturers and where there are some shortfalls or where some work better in different conditions. So starting out with seed placing fertilizer means that they're applying it in the seed row. It's otherwise known as single shoot application. Seed and fertilizer are basically metered into a single tube and delivered to one opener. The fertilizer is then immediately available when the plant needs it, and that would be an advantage to this type of system. But there are limitations on the amount that can be seed placed due to toxicity. Therefore, alternative methods may be required to meet the plant season growing requirements, such as things like deep banding or mid-row banding. So the guidelines for safe rates of fertilizer placed with the seed show the amounts of nitrogen that can be safely placed with the seed. And I will say that these increase as the opener size increases or opener width increases, and they increase as row spacing decreases or narrows. So these two factors together make up a factor known as the seedbed utilization. And seedbed utilization is basically calculated as a percentage, which is equal to the width of the spread of the opener divided by the row spacing times 100. An increasing SBU or seedbed utilization equals increased seed safety, so therefore more can be placed. However, most of these rates will not meet the crop's demand for the growing season. They're notwithstanding applications or additions of enhanced efficiency products that Shannon talked about yesterday. Really, most of these will not meet the demand for any crop during the growing season. And so this is where I said that you need to apply the remaining fertilizer in another place. There are other considerations as well as the nitrogen. In addition, thinking about phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. The safe rates of phosphorus placed with the seed depend on the crop and may not meet the crop demands. In fact, if background levels are low and only the crops that could meet the growing season demand might be cereals, but even then you may run into some issues at some time. Although 50 pounds is a considerable amount, should be able to meet the crop demands. Others not so much. If potassium is included in the amount, then phosphorus needs to be less to accommodate the potassium. So basically, phosphorus plus potassium should not exceed the recommendations for phosphorus, adding the two together. If you're seed placing ammonium sulfate, you need to add the nitrogen in the ammonium sulfate to the other sources of nitrogen to make sure that they do not exceed the safe rates of nitrogen in the table that I showed previously. As well, ammonium sulfate has a particularly high salt index, and research has shown that emergence can be reduced if the rates are near or above 20 pounds of sulfur. So this needs to be kept in mind when we're considering how much fertilizer can actually be seed placed. There are a number of opener configurations available. These would include single or double discs, and these can be simple or very complex. There are other more simpler and probably more common ones, such as the knife and the hole openers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sweep openers here. So I had these pictures drawn up, and I want to thank our regional service rep in PA for her artistic abilities to draw up these pictures. I think they came out really good, and I think that they're a really good representation of the types of openers. Of course, there may be some differences in these than what you see in the field. I couldn't put every type that they're on here that there is because there's just too many of them. So single disc openers usually consist of a large disc that is mounted on an angle relative to the direction of travel. And this angle creates the furrow. And seed and fertilizer are placed beside this disc as the furrow is opened. And in this case, the one seen here, a gauge wheel is used to control the depth. There may be variations on this, including notched discs and with or without gauge wheels, depending on what the purpose of the opener is and the manufacturer. Double disc openers essentially have two discs that are mounted angled to each other, operating like a plow to open the furrow in the soil. Seed and fertilizer are dropped between the discs directly into the furrow. And in this example, the depth is controlled by a packer wheel that runs behind the system. Variations of these may include different sized discs or staggered discs and or notched discs. For most of the systems that I'll talk about, the downforce is created by the weight of a movable frame that is lowered when seeding is in progress, and it pushes basically the openers into the ground. The amount of downforce is controlled then by an adjustable tension. Of course, there are variations to this as well, such as fixed frame units that will apply and regulate downforce through hydraulics. Knife, hoe, and sweep openers. Knife openers are really just a single shaft. They're usually about 3/4 to an inch wide that open up a trench to or the furrow to deposit seed and fertilizer behind them. And basically, this is an example of one on the left here. This shows the basic opener and the mounting of it. There are different types, of course, and we'll have different mounting brackets. But this tube in the back is basically where your fertilizer and seed tube will attach. In the case of the hole opener, they're a little bit wider than the knife openers, can be up to 2 inches. And they will deposit seed and fertilizer either through the opener themselves in a hollow situation or just behind them. Sweep openers are similar to what people may know as a cultivator shovel that lift the soil so that the seed and fertilizer can be deposited through a spreader the width of the shovel. And they're not as common anymore, but they used to be very common. Depending on the width of the sweep, many times there were no discernible rows when these systems were used. Single chute systems with sweeps were referred to as air seeders, differentiating them from the more common air drills that we are accustomed to seeing nowadays. One opener I didn't discuss here, and it is in our guidelines for safe rates of seed placed fertilizer, is the spoon. The spoon is really it's similar to the sweep, but quite a bit smaller, and it doesn't have the wings. So I didn't find a good example of that, so I didn't put that one up here, but you may run across them from time to time. So in these cases, the depth control is usually provided by a limitation to the frame. So when you have a C-shank or attached to a movable frame, just lowering and raising these frames will put the openers in the ground, and then the depth can be set by basically blocks that are put on the hydraulics to limit this movement, as well as some of them will, of course, have options for a fixed frame system. Oops. Basically, advantages to using seed placed fertilizer is that, as I mentioned before, it's immediately available and it improves vigor because it's right next to the seed. It's less available to the weeds because it is just in the row, not between the rows. The lower losses, it has lower losses than broadcast applications of fertilizer, and there's less draft required than the two opener systems. Disadvantages, of course, are that another operation is going to be required to meet the crop demands, such as banding. There is also the potential for salt injury and the potential for ammonium toxicity when rates start to get too high. So this brings us to side banding. Side banding is a system where fertilizer is placed in a band at the time of seeding in a one-pass operation. Fertilizer is separated from the seed, usually beside and or below relative to the seed placement. There are variations on fertilizer relative to seed placement distances, but generally it will range from 1 to 2 inches beside and from 0 to 2 inches below the seed. Another advantage of these systems is that it will reduce fertilizer toxicity due to the proximity to the seed. Therefore, much greater amounts can be placed during seeding. It's suitable for dry and liquid forms of fertilizer, but gaseous forms require a gaseous form such as anhydrous will require a bit more separation from the seed to avoid toxic effects. There are many types of opener configurations and combinations here. I've chosen a few to demonstrate here, and hopefully I've got the most common ones that you'll encounter. Discs with added hole openers, knife or hole openers. I don't have any examples of these because they're already combinations of systems that I mentioned. So essentially they're just discs with an added hole or knife opener to accommodate seed placement. And seed and fertilizer placement is similar to that of the double shank system, which I will discuss here. The other types called the wing type, the paired row opener, or the double disc openers, sorry, double shank openers. The wing type is essentially something that looks similar to this, where a seed and fertilizer is delivered through a single delivery system or double delivery system, through a double delivery system in this case, which go to a single tool and are separated in different tubes. Basically, the fertilizer can be spread beside the seed. Some will cut a furrow to place the fertilizer below and beside the seed. In this case, the one that's given here is directly beside the seed. Oops, I'm having a hard time getting my slides to move. The paired row openers, these systems basically split the seed into two separate rows and place the fertilizer between these rows. Usually it's below the seed level, but some of these are done with a system that actually places the fertilizer at the same depth as the seed. It's done with a single tool, similar to the wing type. Sometimes people may refer to this as a mid-row banding, but it's not the same. Fertilizer placement has a similar distance to seed relationship as other side banding methods, so that's why I have included it in as a side banding method. The double shank system uses two knives traveling one behind the other with a slight offset. The front one is for fertilizer and the back one would be for placing seed. The placement of the fertilizer is approximately 1 to 2 inches beside the seed and 1 to 2 inches below the seed. These double shank systems may be mounted to a fixed height frame or a movable frame, but depth control is usually accomplished by adjusting the packer wheel that follows behind them. And here's an example of how this would be placed in the soil. The seed is basically contained on a shelf that follows after the fertilizer is placed in a band beside and below the seed. Mid-row banding. Mid-row banding is very similar to side banding, but I put it into its own category because of one important difference. It has all the same characteristics as side banding. It also allows fertilizer to be placed or banded at seeding. It also reduces toxicity relative to seed-placed fertilizer. The difference is that it moves the fertilizer further away from the seed, allowing the use of products like anhydrous ammonia. So products then that can be used are the, it's suitable for dry, liquid, and or hydrous ammonia. Products are banded generally about 3 to 6 inches from the seed, depending on your row width, of course, between every second row. The most common type of opener used for mid-row banding is the single disc. And this is a couple of examples of that single disc. So here you have the disc. This is a liquid setup, and your seed placement will be done by the knives that are following. And it's a little hard to see this one. These are also discs, but this is an anhydrous unit. There's a couple of tanks. If you look real close, there's a couple of tanks following this unit, placing anhydrous. One of the disadvantages of that would be, of course, that in that band, if you're placing anhydrous, there's really no other option to place other nutrients at the same time. So the rest of it then has to go in the seed row. And if you're getting borderline on what you can put there, then sometimes there can be some difficulties. But really, the system works very well. So the advantages and disadvantages of side and mid-row banding are that basically they are a one-pass system. This accommodates and gets your fertilizer and your seed in the ground all in one fell swoop. There's improved nutrient efficiency because the fertilizer is placed close to the time the plants will use it, and it is in the root zone. There is less fertilizer required than broadcast applications and better nutrient retention than broadcast applications. Disadvantages to the system might be that there's more time required to transport and fill the inputs that need to be put into this drill. So there's going to be a lot more downtime when you're filling, and this can cause some big headaches at times. Equipment costs are definitely higher. Increased draft is required to pull more openers through the soil. And particularly with side banding, if the fertilizer placement relative to the seed depth stays constant, then the fertilizer may not get to the greater than 2 inches that is required. So it can at times not place fertilizer as deep as you want it, particularly if you're seeding some shallow seeded crops. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Deep banding here, fertilizer is banded at greater than 2 inches deep, usually in the fall or spring and before seeding by a single purpose machine. It adds an operation but reduces filling time during seeding, so it can be very popular that way, particularly up in my region. It's a very popular system. And deep banding can be done with any form of product that you want, dry, liquid, or gaseous forms. So a note here would be that operations that band fertilizers at depths greater than 2 inches are considered to be the gold standard for fertilizer application. These operations can include side banding, mid-row banding, and deep banding, provided the fertilizer is placed at 2 inches or greater. The reasons for this is that it's the best chance to minimize the losses, and because the fertilizer is placed in the ground at a sufficient depth, it allows this to happen. Advantages to deep banding include things like deeper placement. It's independent of the seed depth, so your depth can be set much greater than sometimes with a side banding operation, side or even mid-row banding for that matter. It allows application at a time other than seeding, which can be very beneficial to some operations. It has an improved nutrient efficiency and nutrient retention. Disadvantages is that it adds another operation. So time needs to be put aside for applying fertilizer. Usually this could be in the fall, which makes things a lot easier, provided we have open falls. There's more equipment required, or at least it must be rented. This equipment can be rented, both applicators and tanks. So it's fairly easy to come across them that way. it may occur additional losses. An example here that I've come across, and I'm not sure that it is a real good one, but is that leaching may be a problem with large precipitation events that occur after placement but before seeding. I would suggest that regardless of the placement, this is a potential. You're really only placing it 3 inches away if you're deep banding at 3 inches. So I wouldn't suggest that leaching would be much greater problem with deep banding, but of course I haven't seen a lot of research on that. This brings us to broadcasting. So broadcasting is not considered a 4R practice due to the potential for volatilization losses, but we don't want to lose this option from our toolbox since it may have value for other things such as placement of elemental S applications. Elemental S must oxidize before it becomes plant available, and so generally placing it on the surface in a broadcast application is the best way to utilize elemental S applications. It actually takes much longer for this elemental S to become plant available if it is placed in a band. It can be an advantage for split applications. So in years when nutrients need to be topped up because conditions warrant an increased application, broadcasting can be an effective method of split applications and topping up these nutrients. Perennial forage fertilization. There's really no other way to fertilize established perennial forage stands. So I have seen some people spike in anhydrous through perennial forage stands and have some success with it. But of course, it does cause some damage and can be a difficult thing to do. Really, broadcasting fertilizers on perennial forages is kind of the best way to go. And it can have some advantages for micronutrient applications. Talk a little bit about that in a bit. It can be done with dry or liquid fertilizer with and without incorporation, but it should be noted that it really should be combined with a rain event or incorporated to help minimize the losses. So advantages to broadcasting include it's really easy to apply. The systems are very quick, and you can cover a lot of acres really fast. So it is very attractive that way. It results in a relatively uniform fertilizer distribution. This can be a plus or a negative, I guess, but negative if you're considering the weeds have access to it, but a positive in that it's very uniform application across the field. And it requires generally inexpensive application equipment. But that depends, I guess, a little bit on what type of equipment you're wanting to purchase or have a custom applicator do it. Some of those big floater trucks can be quite expensive, so take this one with a grain of salt, I guess. Disadvantages to it is that it leaves more fertilizer available to weeds, as I mentioned. It enhances nitrogen loss by volatilization, denitrification to some extent, and erosion compared to other placements in the soil. It requires rainfall and or incorporation to move the nitrogen into the plant root zone. And it can leave some non-mobile nutrients such as phosphorus or some micronutrients almost totally on the soil surface, making them unavailable to the plant root systems. So that can be, in some instances, particularly in the case of phosphorus, a very detrimental aspect to broadcasting fertilizers, phosphorus in particular. I wasn't sure exactly where to put this, but I thought since I just discussed the advantages and disadvantages of both deep banding and broadcast fertilizer, I thought this would be a good place for this. This is some research that Rigas Karamanos has shown many, many times, and you may have come across this before. This is the comparison of broadcast and incorporation. That is the mix. So the shallow and deep mix, those are broadcast and incorporation methods at two different depths, deep and shallow, and compared to the two banding methods, or two banding at different depths, basically the same depths. In this case, the broadcast fertilizer was incorporated with a rototiller, maybe not completely a comparison to field equipment, but still at the time, I assume that this was the method that was available for them for small plot research. And so it was incorporated basically to 1 to 2 inches for the shallow placement and incorporated to 5 to 6 inches for the deep placement. And the banding depths were the same. So this research basically suggests that the shallow placement, less than 2 inches deep, of nitrogen may cause higher losses than deep placement. And this is basically the case for both the broadcast incorporation method as well as the banding method. It also shows that deep banding has the highest recovery of nitrogen. Well, it was only done in the years where the 4 trial systems were done. It wasn't done in the 8 trial systems, but I would suspect that if that was done at the same time, there would be a similar result. So it really shows that deep banding has the highest recovery of nitrogen compared to all other methods, hence the gold standard for nitrogen application. And the final application method would be foliar application. And I'm not going to talk a lot about this one. It isn't capable of supplying the entire crop nutrients, no matter how we look at it. Really, suggestions are that we should keep below 18 pounds per acre of nitrogen to avoid leaf burn. I have seen higher applications, but leaf burn was definitely a problem. We're kind of unsure how this contributes to greenhouse gases. The best estimates from some work done in Europe is that it was about 60% efficient, but I was not able to determine exactly how this was measured, if this was the entire nitrogen that the plant took up, both through the leaves and through the soil, but I suspect that that's what it was. There are some studies done by the University of Manitoba that suggest that the uptake from plants through the leaves is only about 1%. But that's not to say that the rest of the nitrogen is lost. Some will, of course, wash off the plant and be taken up by the roots. And this may be where the 60% has come from in European studies. And so it's not a method that we're going to get an awful lot of nutrients applied with. So, I mean, it is definitely a placement method, but I'm not going to say an awful lot about it. So this brings us then to discussing what the losses are, or the losses that we could attribute to the different application methods. And I guess to talk about this beforehand, I think it's important to look at the nitrogen cycle and determine where exactly the inputs are, the removals, and the losses from the system. So the inputs to the system include commercial fertilizers, animal manures, and fixation by plants. And you can see these on the left side of the diagram here. Nitrogen is stored in the soil as ammonium and converted to nitrate. Both forms are plant available. Losses then occur from volatilization of fertilizer as ammonia gas that occurs when the nitrogen is placed on the soil surface too close to the soil surface. This is probably the biggest potential for loss and probably the most preventable by placement. Denitrification is the conversion of nitrate to N2 or nitrous oxide gases by microorganisms that can be lost to the atmosphere. This is not really a function of placement, but some literature does suggest that deeper placement will reduce this loss, so I have included it in here. Leaching is a loss of nitrate due to infiltration of large precipitation events. Again, not as much as of a function of the placement, but there are some publications that suggest, even though there's no, I haven't seen any data on it, that water flow could increase the amount of leaching that happens with deep banding. I know Shannon talked about this yesterday, and I'm not going to go into extreme details about this process, just a basic overview, kind of a reminder as to what volatilization is. So in the process of volatilization of surface applied urea basically converts to ammonium, in the presence of the urease enzyme. And hydrolysis causes a rapid rise in pH around the unprotected urea granule. And this high pH results in more ammonia that can be directly lost to the atmosphere. And that is basically, in a nutshell, a very, very simple explanation of what volatilization is. So volatilization of surface applied nitrogen is dependent on a number of factors. And volatilization is basically one of the biggest concerns and has the highest potential to be, as I mentioned, has the highest potential to be controlled by our placement. So this is why I thought I'd talk about this one first. I'm going to talk about a number of these different factors. Here's some work that was done by Fox and Hoffman in Pennsylvania back in the late 70s or early 80s there, where they looked at the effect of rainfall on nitrogen volatilization. And they found that it was really dependent on the amount of rain that fell, as well as when that rain fell. So they showed that the losses could be as high as 10 to 30% of applied urea if rainfall was delayed up to 5 days, but could be even more and well above 30% if it didn't come at all within the first 5 days. So a significant, basically a significant loss of nitrogen due to volatilization. Some other research, this work done by Overdahl out of Minnesota showed that it also depends on the soil temperature and that the days that the urea was left on the soil surface. Here, Overdahl found through research that the longer the fertilizer was left on the soil surface, and this was up to 10 days rather than 5 days, the greater the losses would be, up to 20% in cases. And basically here, they looked at soil temperatures ranging from 7 degrees Celsius to 32 degrees. And the maximum losses, of course, were when the fertilizer, nitrogen, was left on the surface for up to 10 days at 32 degrees Celsius. Now, this may not apply directly. Most of our soils, it'll be a long time in the season before they ever reach 32 degrees Celsius, if they ever do. But I think it still shows that there's some significant potential for losses. I'll show a little bit more about some other studies in a minute here. Overdahl also looked at the soil pH and the days that urea was left on the soil surface, and he said that volatilization of surface applied nitrogen was dependent on these two factors. He showed that losses could reach almost 45% if it was applied to the soil surface and left for up to 10 days with a pH of 7.5. I think that most people will recognize that we will have pHs in this range within Saskatchewan, but sometimes these pHs can be even higher than this. So again, another significant factor here. I looked up some more research, found that University of Manitoba did some studies on the estimated losses of nitrogen by volatilization. In the study done by a grad student at the University of Manitoba, he found that the potential losses could reach 38 to 46% of urea N applied to the soil surface and left for 5 days at 25 degrees Celsius versus less than 7% loss when the temperatures were 15 degrees Celsius, maybe closer to our spring conditions. But in more recent studies under zero tillage conditions in Brandon, Manitoba, Grant found that 40% of urea could be volatilized in May and up to 80% could be volatilized in July when soils are much warmer. And basically, this was done over a period of 7 days on the soil surface. So the results are somewhat varied, and they're not always in agreement. But the risk of volatilization losses of broadcast urea under the right conditions in Saskatchewan can be estimated to be up to 50% at times. And Fowler and Bryden have have shown this in some of the work that they have done. This is not to say that these losses occur every time, but rather the potential to reach these losses is there. So really, when we're broadcasting nitrogen fertilizer, it may at times be exactly the same or just as good as deep banded fertilizer, but the potential for losses can be much higher, and that's kind of what some of this work is showing. Other conditions that may influence the amount of volatilization of surface applied nitrogen are wet soils that are drying can definitely increase the volatilization potential. Coarse textured soils and low organic matter content soils can definitely increase the volatilization potential because they really don't have the binding sites to hold that nitrogen in the soil. High amounts of surface residue, such as zero tillage conditions, can tie up nitrogen. And the nitrogen source, of course, will influence the amount of fertilizer being volatilized. So urea has a greater potential for volatilization than does a UAN solution, which has a greater potential than ammonium nitrate. Now, of course, we don't have access to ammonium nitrate anymore. This might be similar to ammonium sulfate. Of course, these enhanced efficiency products may also reduce these losses, but I left that for Shannon to talk about in the sources in yesterday's presentation. Other volatilization losses. So volatilization does not just come from surface applications. There's some work done here by John Hurd, Manitoba Agriculture and Food, that showed that shallow banded applications of UAN can have greater volatilization losses than dribble banding UAN. So this is basically the red line compared to the green line here. The red line is the surface application of UAN, dribble banded, and the shallow banded UAN applications, where they found there was actually higher losses in the shallow band. This shallow band was less than 2 inches deep. The deep banding was 3 inches deep. And this situation might apply to situations where shallow seeded crops like canola, where the side band is only 1 inch below the seed and 1 inch to the side, and basically leaving, if you're shallow seeding, it's going to leave the fertilizer in a band that's less than 2 inches deep. Or some may say that it may be due to thinking that suggests that as long as it's in the ground, it's safe, which is not always the case. One might interpret this to mean that surface applications are better than side banding canola. However, I'm not suggesting that that is the case. If you look at the graph, you'll notice that surface applications had a much higher volatilization loss than deep banding. And this suggests to me that the real issue is that the fertilizer needs to be placed deeper and should be probably closer to 3 inches. There are a number of options that you could use in order to increase the depth of fertilizer placement in the side band operation. You might increase the depth of the side bander, and this may require some modifications to the equipment. You may invest in equipment that can actually band fertilizer deeper. Or you could switch to a separate deep banding operation. Denitrification, I said that I wasn't going to say a whole lot about this, and this is really just the main slide that I'm going to have on it. It's really a function of soil moisture. If you want to reduce denitrification, it can be reduced using nitrification inhibitors, applying the fertilizer closer to the time that the plant will use it, and potentially cover crops. Not really a function of placement, but as I mentioned, there is some suggestion that placing it in a deep band may have a benefit to this, as the soil, or the fertilizer would, in a gaseous form, would need to percolate through that soil, and there's a potential that it may be held there. So losses of nutrients to the environment are not the only consideration. Here, I want to talk a little bit about the placement relative to the use efficiency, and correct placement can enhance nutrient availability and plant uptakes. So proximity to the roots is one of the biggest factors. When nutrients that are concentrated in a band within the root zone stimulate root growth and plant vigor. And fertilizer in the root zone improves the chance that the roots will intercept these nutrients early in the growing season and can potentially have yield impacts. And this may be delayed if there isn't a sufficient amount of rain to move the nutrients to the root zone in a timely fashion when the plants are needing it. This could be the case in broadcast applications. Low soil temperatures can impact the processes such as plant nutrient absorption, soil chemical reactions, and nutrient movement to the plant roots are generally much slower when soil temperatures are low. When plants are small and growing slowly due to low soil temperatures, it's more important to place nutrients close to these roots so that they can uptake them quickly and get a bit of a boost. Soil moisture, nutrients must be dissolved to be plant available. And there's a better chance or better potential for that to happen if they're placed in the moist soil zones. As well, we talked a little bit about this before, placing fertilizer in a concentrated band in the root zone tends to favor the crops and limit the supply to the weeds between the rows. Of course, the ones within the rows will still have a constant supply of fertilizer. Placement relative to other nutrients. So phosphorus definitely has a low soil mobility. Low soil temperatures and high soil pH reduce phosphorus availability in the soil. And this nutrient needs to be placed in the root zone to facilitate root interception. This has been backed up by numerous studies, and basically it's a well-known fact that really placing it in the soil is kind of the only way to go. Potassium, on the other hand, placement is a little less critical. It could be broadcast or banded. 90% of the time, the broadcast and band applications are equivalent, so I haven't got a lot to say about whether or not to place potassium in the soil. Sulfur, of course, available sulfur behaves a little bit like nitrate in the soils because it's mobile and it is subject to leaching. If it wasn't for the nitrogen in ammonium sulfate, the placement would not be as critical, although there is some potential for sulfur to volatilize, as Shannon pointed out yesterday. But the nitrogen in this source really has the potential, does have the potential for volatilization. So ammonium sulfate should likely be placed in the soil. And that elemental S, on the other hand, works better if it's allowed to oxidize on the surface before it's moved into the soil. So broadcast applications of elemental S are fine. Placement of other nutrients. Boron, of course, boron acts similar to nitrate and sulfate in the soil, but moves at a bit slower rate. High concentrations of boron in the soil are toxic. Consequently, the application of boron should be broadcast treatment or foliar application. These are the best methods. It should never actually be placed in the seed row or in a band due to its toxicity. There is a bit of information on other micronutrients, copper, manganese, and zinc. It's difficult to determine exactly whether there is a benefit to broadcasting. Most application or most research suggests that it is there's a benefit to banding them, but they may be broadcast and are in many operations. That would have to be examined a little bit more. So, in summary, I'd just like to say that there are numerous placement options, and we need to keep all of these in our toolbox. All of the placement options have a purpose and have a benefit for specific applications. There's a variety of equipment options, and I hope this gave a little bit better understanding of how they work and what they look like. And finally, deep banding fertilizer greater than 2 inches has the potential to reduce nutrient losses. It has the potential to improve nutrient use efficiency and maximize yield, and is considered the gold standard, particularly for nitrogen application. And with that, I'll leave it at that. And I just thought I'd put up my contact information if anybody's interested in getting in touch with me and discussing any more of what I talked about today in more detailed discussion. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Kim, for that great presentation. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please enter them into the question box on the bottom of your control panel, and we'll get right into the questions. So Kim, your first one is there a limit to the amount of nitrogen you can put down in a sideband situation if it's only 1 inch away from the seed?
If there is, I'm not sure what that value would be. I know that there has been some work done on that. There is suggestion that if it gets too high, it could get toxic. Hence, you cannot put anhydrous ammonia in a sideband. It's just too close, and the potential for toxic effects will happen, but I don't know what that value would be.
All right. Next question is, does the type of crop you are growing or the location in the province affect which placement you would use or the equipment you would use?
It may have it in some instances, and that's a very complex question. There's a lot of factors that would be involved in that. Really, I would suggest that deep banding is still, regardless of the area of the province that you live in, it's still a gold standard and the best placement for nitrogen fertilizer in particular. Volatilization losses could happen in any place in the province, and so they may not happen in some years, but they could happen in others. And really, right now, there's quite a bit of increased scrutiny on the fact that nitrogen is a very strong greenhouse gas. And so this is really bringing fertilizer application into heavier scrutiny. And one of the best methods to reduce volatilization losses and greenhouse gases is to limit the amount of emissions by putting these fertilizers in the soil. As far as the equipment is concerned, that's a discussion for another day.
All right. Next one is, what does the application by a floater mean, and when can it be a good idea, and when is it a bad idea?
Okay, so any piece of equipment that broadcasts fertilizer, so there are fertilizer spreaders, there are Valmar systems, there are floater trucks, basically anything that is broadcasting nutrients on the surface of the soil would be considered a floater. The difference might be liquid applications such as dribble banding or even foliar applications. That's usually done through some sort of a sprayer application system. But floating basically means to apply the nutrients to the soil surface. Sorry, was there a second part to that question? Did I miss?
Oh yeah, so it's when is it a good idea and when is it a bad idea?
Okay, so there definitely, as I've suggested, there are some situations where we may need to take advantage of broadcast applications. Those would be, for instance, when we're applying split applications of nutrients. So in situations where we've had dry seasons and the situation is dry in the spring and it doesn't really warrant large applications of nutrients, but then weather conditions turn around later on and we're starting to see wetter conditions and yield potentials are higher. Broadcast applications could be used, but again, they should be combined with a weather event such as precipitation to wash them into the soil, as well as applying elemental S and applying boron and that sort of thing.
Okay. Is dribble banding UAN with a sprayer before or at the time of seeding considered a 4R practice?
I would say no, because as we've seen, the potential, the work that was done there, the potential for volatilization losses are still higher than banding. So, and the 4R practices suggest that the fertilizer needs to be placed in the soil.
Okay. How much rainfall would you have to get before worrying about leaching losses for deep banded nitrogen and sulfur on lighter textured soil?
Well, that's kind of a loaded question. I guess it depends. It really depends on how much moisture is in the soil already. It depends on whether there are heavier textures of soils, lower. It's not something that I could answer with one specific amount. Large weather events that we've seen dropping 3 to 6 inches of rain may have potential for leaching of nutrients, particularly in lighter soils, but I could not say exactly how much is required to move it through the soil and how deep it would go.
Okay. On the other volatilization losses slide, comparing shallow and deep, or shallow versus deep versus surface application, the work was done with UAN. Would urea be more or less the same?
I would expect higher losses from urea.
Okay.
And that's because only half of the UAN is in the urea form. The other half is in the ammonia form, which makes it less susceptible to volatilization losses.
Perfect. With a seed blend that includes N, P, K, and S, how do you calculate the amount that would be safe with either canola or wheat?
Basically the tables give the amounts that are safe for seed placed rates. These can be changed a little bit with the addition of something like an enhanced efficiency product like polymer urea. But basically, the tables are included in the presentation. If I go back to those tables, oh, so long was back here. Here we go. So based on the size of your opener and the row spacing, this is kind of the maximum rates that you should use in canola, depending on your soil type, of course. And these are the rates that would be used for cereals. With phosphorus, these are the rates that are suggested that are safe rates for seed placing in cereals, canola, canary seed, and so on. Potassium, of course, needs to be combined with the amount of phosphorus. So basically, well, however much phosphorus you're putting down plus the rate of your potassium should not exceed the recommendations for phosphorus. So if you're going to put down 20 pounds of potassium, then you'll only have room for 30 pounds of phosphorus in cereals, for example. And sulfur should not exceed 20 pounds. But the nitrogen in that source needs to be added in with the nitrogen that you're already placing from other sources so that it does not exceed the amount in the tables prior to this. Does that answer the question?
I think it does, yep. So the next one is going to be kind of in two parts. So I'll give you the first one and then I'll give you the second half of it. When it comes to topping up on phos with a perennial like third year alfalfa, which method is most effective or efficient?
So with a perennial forage, really, if I read this correctly, with perennial forage, basically there is no option for fertilizing phosphorus in the perennial forage other than broadcasting. So broadcasting of phosphorus usually it's suggested that the rate needs to be about double that of what your recommendation is in order for that to get into the soil and have a response. But essentially, that really the only way to do it would be um, to broadcast. I suppose that if you had a system that could band um, liquid phosphorus into the soil, that may be another potential. And then in that case, you wouldn't need to double the application because it would be directly into the soil. The only difference is that it will cause some destruction in the area where it's placed. Now that comes back in time, but it depends on what you're willing to live with, I guess.
Perfect. You actually answered most of the second question, because the second question was about broadcasting P on forages. But so the second half of that little piece is there any issues with low mobility of the phosphorus that you broadcast?
Yes, there is, and that's why the recommendation, and I'd have to go consult the forage agronomist a little bit more, but their recommendation, to my understanding, is generally around twice the rate.
Okay. And what depth is considered deep banded?
Generally below 2 inches is considered deep banded.
Okay. If liquid phosphorus is surface applied in fall, will spring seeding help move it to the root zone for plant uptake?
That depends completely on the seeding equipment. So some seeding equipment will has more soil disturbance than others. So in high disturbance, it will definitely help move it into the soil. But there's no guarantee that it will get all of it into the root zone and that it will be available that way. Some of it could potentially still be stranded on the surface, even with the seeding operation. If you're using something with a very narrow opener, the chances of that getting into the ground are minimal because the soil disturbance is so small.
Okay. There's a few more phosphorus ones, so we'll stick with those. Phosphorus applied in row with seed with a 3/4 inch knife when seeding canola has become a challenge to meet our yield goals. Can you speak to foliar applications to help boost pH for the crop or any other recommendations?
I can't really speak to foliar applications. I haven't seen a lot of work on that. I do agree that with bigger crops that there is an increased demand for phosphorus, and that in some situations we haven't been putting back what we have been taking out. So there's an increased requirement to add more phosphorus. It can't all go in the seed row. There, at the crop diagnostic school last year, we showed some implications of having too high a phosphorus in the seed row. It can definitely have some toxicity problems, particularly to the nitrogen that's in there. So if phosphorus is a requirement and soils are reaching a deficient state, then it needs to be put in another method. And that is either through the sideband or through a deep band.
Okay. Would nitrogen loss inhibitors be considered a 4R practice when used in a broadcast application?
Good question. I know that 4R practices encourage the use of enhanced efficiency products. And that, I think it depends a little bit on the situation. If any fertilizer, regardless of whether it has an inhibitor or is an enhanced efficiency product, is placed on the surface for any length of time, and the longer time that it's left on the surface, the higher the potential is for volatilization losses. At some point, there is potential for volatilization losses if precipitation doesn't come to wash that into the soil. So in that case, I would say no. But I mean, if it was put on with a rain event that washed it into the soil, I think an argument could be made that it would be a 4-hour practice. Although I do not think that Fertilizer Canada would ever define it as a 4-hour practice.
Perfect. I often get mixed up when dealing with actual pounds of phosphorus and P2O5. Where is a good resource to help keep that straight?
I have a few of them. I just don't have them off the top of my head. If you send me your email address, I'll send you that information.
Perfect. Oh yeah. How does the fact that the seed safe phosphate rate research was done with 34-10-00 fertilizer and not current phosphate sources potentially affect recommendations?
Sorry, say that again.
How does the fact that the seed safe phosphate rate research was done with 34-10-00 fertilizer and not current phosphate sources potentially affect recommendations?
I'm not sure that it was done with 1034. It was likely done with dry fertilizer, and how that affects recommendations, I don't know. I don't know how it would affect it.
All right, Kate. Well, that's the last question for today. So thank you and great job with speaking and answering the questions.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And thank you everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us for this event. If you have entered your CCA number during registration, we'll make sure to send those along to the appropriate person and make sure you receive credit. Credits are only available to those who are watching the webinar live. As mentioned previously, all webinar and video recordings will be shared later with you this week, and you can watch them at any time. If anybody has any questions regarding these topics, feedback on the webinar, or anything else related to farming, please contact your local SaskAg regional office or the AKC at 1-866-457-2377. And we'll be sure to put you in contact with a specialist to help answer your questions. And thanks again for joining us for today's session.